There's a point in the existence of every authoritarian structure when the arithmetic of continuation shifts so completely, so irreversibly, and so visibly that the structure can no longer maintain the fiction that the old equations still function. It is not always one singular dramatic moment. It is not always a battle surrendered or a capital fallen or a commander eliminated. Sometimes it is a weekend. Sometimes it is 72 hours in which every assumption the regime constructed its posture upon dissolves at once. In which the analytical divisions of the world's most formidable nation cancel scheduled leave and assemble targeting options and brace for the strikes that every observer expects to materialize. And then instead of strikes, a capitulation framework leaks from inside the regime itself, carrying provisions so concessive, so historically without precedent, so nakedly desperate that the word surrender is not inflammatory language. It is the only technically accurate term available. That weekend just concluded, and what emerged from it, the leaked memorandum, the Iranian functionaries celebrating before the framework is even formalized, the White House falling into a silence that communicates more than any formal statement, the American senators erupting in outrage, the Pakistani prime minister hosting the conversations while the world trains its attention on his capital, is the account of a regime that spent 47 years assuring its population it would never yield to Washington, discovering across a single Memorial Day weekend that yielding is the only instrument it has remaining. Let us begin with the hours preceding the agreement. Because to comprehend the capitulation, you must first comprehend the terror that preceded it. You must understand what the atmosphere in Washington resembled during the 72 hours before Iranian officials began circulating cryptic references to Roman emperors and Persian triumphs. The earliest signal originated from the White House itself. President Trump declined attendance at a family wedding to remain at his desk in Washington. That detail alone, a sitting president forgoing a family occasion to remain at his post, communicates to anyone who monitors these situations that something consequential is either unfolding or approaching. Presidents do not bypass weddings for routine diplomatic management. They bypass weddings when the briefings on their desk are telling them that the next 3 days will determine something that cannot be subsequently reversed. Then came the CBS News reporting confirming that American service members were having their Memorial Day weekend leave revoked. Military leave cancellations are not a nuanced signal. They are the operational preparation stage for imminent kinetic action. Every defense analyst, every intelligence monitor, every correspondent who covers national security understood immediately what that revocation signified. Washington was preparing to strike. Then the Pentagon validated it directly through through unnamed officials speaking to trusted outlets. Strike packages were being assembled. The president was being presented with options. The military was positioned. All that remained was the command. And then the intelligence surfaced regarding the assassination operation. An Iraqi national, a trained operative, a member of the IRGC's extended operational network, had been detained after making a specific, documented operational commitment to eliminate Ivanka Trump. Not a generalized threat, not rhetorical posturing on a state broadcasting platform. A specific operative with a specific target, architectural schematics of her Florida property, and a statement documented and reported by the New York Post that exposed precisely what the Islamic Republic had been reduced to as a functioning strategic actor. We need to kill Ivanka to burn down the house of Trump the way he burned down our house. That statement, that operationally serious, personally targeted elimination plot, is the statement of a regime operating not from strategic reasoning, but from grief and desperation, and the primitive political logic of retaliation that has no terminus and no strategic upside. It is the statement of a governing system that has forfeited the capacity for strategic thought and is now functioning on pure reactive instinct. The world was positioned for strikes. The leave was canceled. The targeting packages were assembled. The intelligence about the assassination operation had handed the Trump administration both the legal justification and the domestic political momentum for a comprehensive bombing campaign that public sentiment would have endorsed without reservation. And then instead of strikes, a capitulation framework leaked. The leak originated with 3 Iranian officials, not from the White House, not from a neutral intermediary, from inside the regime itself, and that origin, the fact that the terms of Iran's surrender reached the world through Iranian officials rather than American ones, reveals everything necessary to understand about the strategic calculus directing the regime's conduct in this moment. Tehran wanted to control the framing. Tehran wanted to be the entity that shaped the terms of the arrangement, that presented the concessions in the most favorable available light, that managed the account for the domestic audience that had spent 2 months watching its country absorb strikes, its currency deteriorate further, its food costs climb another 20%, its supreme leader dissolve into an AI-generated presence. The White House went quiet. Not inadvertently. The White House went quiet because it recognized that allowing Tehran to frame the narrative temporarily was an acceptable cost if the alternative was watching the framework collapse because IRGC hardliners used American triumphalism as the justification for destroying the agreement. So Tehran spoke. And the provisions it described were simultaneously the most significant diplomatic development in the broader Middle East in a generation, and a demonstration of how a losing party presents its defeat as something categorically different. According to those three Iranian officials, Tehran had agreed to a memorandum of understanding that would terminate all hostilities, including those in Lebanon, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and permit commercial movement to proceed without Iran extracting a transit toll. In exchange, Washington would lift its naval blockade. $25 billion in frozen Iranian assets would be returned to the Islamic Republic. And the nuclear question, the entire foundation of the conflict, the central strategic objective around which Operation Epic Fury was constructed, would be deferred to a subsequent negotiation within 30 to 60 days following the memorandum's execution. Those were the conditions Tehran described. And if those conditions represented the complete picture, they would constitute something approximating the arrangement the losing party always attempts to negotiate. Arrest the immediate hemorrhaging, recover the frozen capital, defer the most painful concession to a future conversation that may never materialize. Tehran was describing an arrangement in which it relinquished control of the Strait it had already effectively forfeited and postponed the nuclear question while collecting $25 billion in sanctions relief. That framing explains why Iranian officials were celebrating openly and immediately, circulating references to Roman emperors absorbing lessons from Persian counterparts, transmitting to the domestic audience the message that the resistance had generated outcomes, that the concessions were survivable, that the Islamic Republic had endured. Then the American side communicated through the mechanism the White House employs when it wants something acknowledged without formal attribution. An unnamed official speaking to the New York Times, and what that unnamed official disclosed fundamentally transformed the entire account. Washington confirmed that one provision of the proposed arrangement represents an apparent commitment by Tehran to surrender its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, not defer the discussion, not agree to revisit it subsequently. Surrender the stockpile. The officials acknowledged that the proposal has not yet resolved precisely how Tehran would dispose of the uranium, the logistics, the verification architecture, the timeline, but the general commitment in writing, Tehran's agreement to relinquish the uranium, was reportedly embedded in the framework. That single provision, buried in the American unnamed readout, absent from the Iranian official celebration posts, is the provision that fundamentally redefines the nature of what transpired this weekend. Tehran was describing an arrangement in which it surrendered the Strait it had already lost while quietly committing in writing to relinquish its highly enriched uranium stockpile, a commitment it was desperately hoping its own domestic audience would not detect. The reason Tehran did not want that provision public is specific and documented. The previous time Tehran approached agreement on surrendering its enriched uranium approximately 1 month earlier, there were literal street demonstrations from pro-IRGC constituencies in the capital. The individuals who backed the regime and have constructed their political identity around the Islamic Republic's defiance of Washington did not want their government surrendering the uranium. The uranium was the emblem. The uranium was the evidence that 47 years of resistance had generated something tangible, something irreversible, something that provided Tehran a strategic instrument no volume of American pressure could simply confiscate. Relinquishing the uranium is not merely a diplomatic concession. It is the symbolic demolition of the resistance narrative. The regime wanted to surrender the uranium quietly, buried in a follow-up negotiation, concealed inside a framework it could present to the domestic audience as a Persian triumph. The American side ensured the world understood the commitment was already embedded in the framework. Both accounts cannot simultaneously reflect reality. Either Tehran is already committed in writing to surrendering its highly enriched uranium, which is what American officials assert, or the uranium question is genuinely deferred, which is what Iranian officials maintain. Someone is managing the account, and the question of who is presenting a distorted picture carries consequences extending far beyond the immediate arrangement. If Tehran is misrepresenting the situation to its domestic constituency, framing a uranium surrender as a deferred discussion to prevent the street demonstrations that a public acknowledgement would generate, that is manageable from Washington's perspective. The commitment exists in writing. But if American officials are overstating what Tehran has committed to, if the uranium provision is softer, more conditional than the unnamed readout implies, then the consequences are severe. Not merely domestically, with midterm elections approaching and a Republican caucus characterizing the arrangement as catastrophic, but internationally, among partners who depend on American security assurances and are monitoring whether American commitments carry the weight assigned them. The American political reaction was immediate, furious, and deeply illuminating. Mike Pompeo stated publicly that if the disclosed conditions were accurate, the United States should simply recommence military operations immediately. His position was direct. There is no rationale for surrendering everything Washington achieved through Operation Epic Fury in exchange for conditions that leave Tehran's nuclear architecture essentially undisturbed and reward the regime with $25 billion in relief. Senator Roger Wicker characterized the arrangement as a catastrophe that would undo everything accomplished through Operation Epic Fury. Senator Lindsey Graham expressed the identical assessment. Senator Ted Cruz amplified the message. These are the senior Republican senators with the deepest institutional knowledge of American military capacity and its strategic objectives across the Middle East. They were on the record communicating that the arrangement being described from Tehran was unacceptable, that Washington had deployed its full capacity to generate conditions for a genuinely transformative agreement, and was now apparently preparing to accept something substantially less. Their public statements constituted pressure. They were the institutional voice of American strategic firmness, communicating that any arrangement that did not permanently and verifiably eliminate Tehran's nuclear capacity and generate meaningful accountability for 47 years of Iranian-sponsored terrorism would be characterized as capitulation rather than achievement. The Gulf states warrant specific examination because their role in advocating for the arrangement reveals something consequential about the regional considerations driving every participant's calculations. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal both confirmed that Gulf leadership and specifically from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, were actively pressing Washington to formalize some version of an agreement. The Gulf states were advocating for resolution, not because they support the Iranian regime. They were advocating because they had spent 2 months watching intercepted projectiles damage their infrastructure, aerial strikes target their industrial installations, and their petroleum facilities ignited by the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz had been functionally disrupted by the Iranian blockade and counter-blockade dynamics. Every day the strait remained closed represented constrained Gulf revenues and volatility that renders long-term infrastructure investment impossible. Saudi Arabia, which has developed Vision 2030 requiring regional stability as its foundation, cannot sustain a permanently militarized Gulf. The UAE, which built Dubai into a global commercial center on dependable regional connectivity, cannot function with a permanently closed strait. Qatar, hosting the American military installations central to the conflict, was navigating the impossible position of hosting the military capacity destroying its neighbor, while preserving commercial relationships on both sides. The Gulf states wanted resolution because open-ended military confrontation is existentially incompatible with the economic futures they are constructing. Their advocacy with Washington was commercial and strategic self-interest expressed through diplomatic channels cultivated precisely for these moments. Pakistan's function in this account is simultaneously meaningful and revealing of its constraints. The Pakistani Prime Minister confirmed that negotiations were continuing, that President Trump had made extraordinary efforts toward peace, and that Pakistan would maintain its mediating role while hoping to host subsequent discussions. The statement was measured and notably absent any confirmation that an arrangement had been finalized, which contradicted the triumphant register of Iranian officials celebrating on social media, while Pakistan's intermediary quietly communicated that nothing was concluded. Pakistan wanted the visibility that hosting consequential negotiations generates. Observers note that Pakistani officials appear as motivated by diplomatic prominence as by substantive outcome. That is not disqualifying in an intermediary. Your prestige motivations can align with substantive achievement. But the concern analysts have raised is more serious than prestige seeking. The concern is that Pakistan not become what Oman represented before the conflict, a channel Tehran exploited not for genuine negotiation, but for managing American diplomatic posture, generating the appearance of engagement while the IRGC continued constructing the capabilities that engagement was meant to address. Now let us examine what the Iranian population actually experienced across this weekend, because the distance between the regime's narrative, the Persian triumph, the arrangement on Iranian terms, the resistance that generated outcomes, and the lived reality of ordinary Iranians is so vast it constitutes its own political emergency. The currency is trading at 1.44 million reals to the dollar. Dairy costs are rising 20% from June 1st. Food price inflation is running at 72% annually. The demonstrations that commenced December 28, 2025 remain active across 675 locations, spanning all 31 provinces. The nighttime anti-regime chants continue echoing from apartment buildings across a dozen cities. The supreme leader remains in calm, communicating through AI-generated recordings, absent from public life in every functional sense. Into this environment, the regime is attempting to market a peace arrangement as a triumph. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson posted a statement referencing Persian victories in a conflict set in 2060 AD, while citing a negotiated resolution from an entirely different historical era, transmitting simultaneously the message of military victory and diplomatic settlement, a contradiction so transparent that Iranians with telegram access could parse it immediately. The regime requires the arrangement to appear victorious because the accurate characterization that Tehran is surrendering its highly enriched uranium, reopening the strait it closed, suspending proxy operations across Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq, and accepting an American security architecture that leaves the IRGC fundamentally constrained, renders 47 years of sacrifice incomprehensible. If the arrangement resembles what the American official described, then every sanction endured, every executed dissident, every killed demonstrator, every depreciated real was the price of arriving at precisely the position Tehran could have occupied in 2015 had it honored the nuclear framework. The Iranian population understands this arithmetic. The taxi operator who described to Al Jazeera how dairy prices multiplied 6 times in 1 year understands it. The merchant who shuttered his stall and joined the demonstrations understands it. The regime is selling a Persian triumph narrative to a population that can observe the price of eggs and has watched their supreme leader dissolve into AI recordings for 6 weeks. The narrative is not finding purchase. There is a dimension of this capitulation account that has received almost no analytical attention, but may prove its most consequential long-term consequence. The elimination plot targeting Ivanka Trump, the IRGC-connected operative with architectural schematics of her Florida property and the documented pledge to burn down the house of Trump the way Trump burned down their house, materialized at the precise moment the regime was simultaneously attempting to negotiate a peace framework. Consider what that simultaneity reveals about the coherence of Iranian decision-making in May 2026. One faction of the Iranian system, oriented towards civilian governance and the pragmatists who understand the only viable path requires an arrangement with Washington, is negotiating, disclosing terms, posting Persian triumph statements, attempting to manage the narrative of capitulation into something the domestic audience can absorb. Another faction of the IRGC hardliners who have been trading explicit threats in parliamentary chambers over any ceasefire, the faction that declared through Hamid Rasaei that executing any ceasefire simply invites subsequent strikes, is simultaneously running elimination operations against the American president's family. These are not two separate entities. They are two factions of a single government operating in direct contradiction of one another, exposing the fracturing Trump accurately described when he observed that Iran's governing structure is seriously fractured. The elimination plot did not destroy the arrangement. The Trump administration apparently concluded the capitulation framework carried more strategic value than another round of strikes. But the plot's existence, its operational precision, its personal targeting of the president's family, communicates everything about the IRGC hardliners' genuine strategic orientation. They are not participating in the capitulation. They are not endorsing the memorandum. They are conducting elimination operations against American civilians while the civilian faction posts Roman history references and tells the world an arrangement is concluded. That internal contradiction between the faction surrendering and the faction still prosecuting the conflict causes every analyst who takes the arrangement seriously to also take its fragility seriously. You cannot sustain a durable peace framework with a government simultaneously negotiating resolution and orchestrating assassinations. The question of whether IRGC hardliners are incorporated into the framework, marginalized by it, or removed from the equation through the arrangement's constraints, determines whether the memorandum becomes the historic agreement concluding the confrontation or another entry in the register of Iranian diplomatic frameworks that dissolved when the IRGC determined it was not bound by what the civilian administration accepted. The absent supreme leader problem sits at the center of everything. Any arrangement Tehran executes requires constitutional ratification by the supreme leader. That says, a noir surprise. That is how the Islamic Republic's decision-making architecture functions. Without his active functional endorsement, every Iranian signature is provisional. Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared publicly since his designation on March 8, 2026. He is in Qom receiving medical attention according to a diplomatic cable obtained by the Times of London. Israeli intelligence characterizes him as a hollow entity who neither controls nor directs the regime. He is generating AI-recorded addresses that Iranians openly ridicule on Telegram. He is constitutionally required to provide the authority making the peace framework real. And he is functionally absent from the decision-making process that produced it. This generates the specific nightmare scenario American senators are flagging. Tehran executes the memorandum. The blockade is suspended. The $25 billion is dispersed. Commercial movement resumes through the Strait. And then in the follow-up negotiations 30 to 60 days later, when the uranium question must be resolved with specificity, the IRGC hardliners produce a new supreme leader ruling that reinterprets the uranium commitment in ways that render it unverifiable or unenforceable. That is the structural risk Pompeo and Wicker and Graham are identifying. Not that the arrangement is problematic on its face, but that an arrangement executed by a government this fractured, anchored to a supreme leader this absent, with IRGC factions still conducting elimination operations and trading parliamentary threats, is an arrangement American military pressure rendered achievable, but that the American diplomatic architecture may not be capable of making permanent. Here is where this stands. As of the concluding days of May 2026, the Memorandum of Understanding framework exists. 3 Iranian officials have confirmed its broad contours. American unnamed officials have confirmed that a uranium surrender commitment is embedded in the framework. Gulf states are pressing for formalization. Pakistan is offering Islamabad as the venue for subsequent discussions. Trump has confirmed on Truth Social that an arrangement has been substantially negotiated subject to formalization, employing the formal designation Islamic Republic of Iran in a manner his own team noted was without precedent. The military leave canceled for Memorial Day weekend has presumably been restored, suggesting the immediate strike campaign was deferred in favor of the diplomatic framework. The Iranian Foreign Ministry is celebrating on social media with Roman historical references, while hoping its domestic audience does not register the uranium commitment embedded in the American readout. The IRGC hardliners are openly furious in parliamentary chambers, cautioning that any arrangement simply invites subsequent strikes in the autumn. And the Supreme Leader remains in calm, receiving medical treatment, producing AI-generated communications for his population, constitutionally required to ratify an agreement that competing factions are simultaneously executing and threatening to destroy. The terror is real. The capitulation is real. The fragility of what has been agreed to is equally real. And the summer approaching, with its 40-degree temperatures and power interruptions and dairy cost increases and 675 demonstration locations and nighttime anti-regime chants, will determine whether the surrender framework holds or becomes the latest entry in the register of Iranian diplomatic commitments that carried different meanings than the language suggested. The regime panicked. The regime issued its capitulation. Whether the capitulation endures is the account still being written. Subscribe and activate notifications. We will be here when the next chapter arrives.